This FedGov Today program is sponsored by Maximus. On this edition of FedGov Today with Francis Rose, a huge task ahead for the Pentagon's weapons testing community.
We're going to have to put a lot more effort into the science and technology to hone this, to validate it, to make sure it actually works and is not just giving us results that look good on paper, but actually reflect reality.
Former Director of the Office of Testing and Evaluation at DoD, Doug Schmidt, on FedGov Today in just a moment. Uniting program strategy, advanced technology, process, and execution for a more efficient government. That's Maximus. Every program, every service, every time. That's innovation forward. Learn more at maximus.com/federal. The Office of the Director of Operational Test and Evaluation at the Defense Department is slimming down. Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth's directive about OT&E includes 5 points. Doug Schmidt is Dean of the School of Computing, Data Sciences, and Physics at the College of William and Mary. He's former director of the Office of OT&E. Doug, it is great to have you on the program. Congratulations on standing up that school and serving as the first dean of it. And it's great to have you on the program and talk to you again. What's your takeaway from this memo about OT&E and how it will impact your former office and how it will impact the stakeholders that you interacted with and served in that office? Welcome, Dean.
Thank you very much, and thank you for having me, Francis. I'll touch on a couple of different topics. First of all, when I was there as the Director of Operational Test and Evaluation for last year, one of the challenges we faced was how to provide effective oversight of all the emerging rapid capability systems. These are things like the replicator system, and I think we're seeing more and more in the DoD and around the world, movement away from a few exquisite systems to a much larger number of lower cost systems. And that makes perfect sense. I also understand there's been a lot of work lately about trying to streamline the acquisition process so that we can acquire those systems more effectively. But even back when I was there, one of the challenges we had was how do we put effective oversight on rapidly evolving technologies? And one of the things that we want to make sure we didn't do was get in the way of the innovation. We didn't want to start having heavyweight oversight so that people who are trying to do these rapid capabilities would end up spending more time in the testing phase and slow down deliveries of the system. That's also well and good as well. But the problem that we're going to run up against is a lot of these systems are being built by non-traditional providers, which is also fine, except the challenge here is the cost of integration and the cost of validating and certifying and understanding how these different pieces will work together. And that's where some of my concerns are, especially with respect to the downsizing of the people involved. So right now, a lot of these rapid capability programs don't have proper testing environments. They certainly don't have testing environments that are going to be testing in an operationally realistic or effective way. So we don't really know what they're going to be able to do. And even with the best of intentions, we all know when contractors start to, or even government services, military services, start to do the testing, that's almost always the first thing to get cut when the budget gets short and the time gets short. So we're going to have a situation where lots of these systems are going to be deployable, and yet no one is going to have any definitive understanding of how they're going to work together, not only within their own set of capabilities, but especially when integrated into the joint force through things like the joint JADC2, the joint command and control, all domain operation kind of systems. And so that's the thing that we're going to be missing out on if we're not careful. Now, there's several ways forward. We could hire more people back and try to deal with the problem with workforce, or we could find a way of using innovation and technology to be more effective at testing these systems using automation and, of course, artificial intelligence.
There are a couple of things in this memo that I want to ask you about and thinking about what the way forward is to address all of the issues that you just outlined. But you mentioned something there that I think is really important, and that is the understanding the cost of integration. And it strikes me the other integration issue is not just cost, but who is the right or what is the right organization to do that? And there's been a debate ongoing about integrators of all kinds, of whether it's information technology or weapon systems or whatever over the years. Is the Defense Department the best organization to determine the success or lack thereof of the integration of all of its systems together? Or is that something that somebody else, i.e. a contractor, could or should really do? I guess inherently governmental is the term that comes to mind, Doug.
Well, it needs to be a team effort. Obviously, the contractors, both big and small and new and old, need to be heavily involved in that process. And one of the nice things is a lot of the newer contractors come from a world where experimentation and prototyping is part of their DNA, and that's also great. But the challenge is that very few people have all the parts of the elephant. So if you're out there building a new missile or a new drone or so on, you're probably going to test it in isolation, and you might even test it with a handful of other things. But it's very unlikely that any of these contractors, especially the newer ones that don't have the history and all the relationships with ranges and with larger scale integration, are going to be able to test their particular widget or their particular drone with all the other things that need to go into making it effective capability in a modern battle space. And that's where you really need to have some organization, and it historically has been the Director of Operational Test and Evaluation coming to put things together to make sure that the test ranges and the exercises that are being done in a way that is reflective of what our brave warfighters are likely to encounter when they have to field these missions in earnest and in conflict.
I mentioned there are 5 points to this directive from Secretary Hegseth. 2 of them, I think, and please correct me if I'm wrong, but 2 of them to me seem to be pretty self-evident. Starting at the bottom, the 5th was the appointment of Carol Quaid, who is transitioning from Deputy for Test and Evaluation at the Navy Department to perform the duties of the Director of OT&E, your former position. And the first one on this list of 5 is that OT&E will immediately eliminate any non-statutory or redundant functions, reducing bureaucratic overhead and driving greater efficiency. I think that speaks for itself, especially in the context of what the administration has undertaken since it has come into office. The second on the list is OT&E will deliver its core statutory function through a reduced staff of 30 civilian positions with no more than 1 senior executive service member and 15 assigned military personnel. So that gets right to the core of what you just expressed a moment ago, Doug. They're going to go with fewer people, so the converse of that seems to be more automation. What's your view on what more automation inside an office like OT&E will look like? And again, as we said at the beginning, how does this drive the result that the department needs based on the context that you just gave about what the office is supposed to perform?
So first and foremost, I'm a huge fan of automation. I'm also a huge fan of AI, but I'm also a huge fan of responsible automation and responsible AI, where we actually know what it is we're testing. We know the capabilities and the limits of the tools that we're using. When I was the DOT&E, we had a number of R&D efforts underway in order to be able to evaluate the use of automation and to see what would work, what wouldn't, under what conditions it would work. And I think it's also important to mention here that in addition to downsizing the staff of DOT&E, there's also efforts afoot to downsize the support contractors, people like the Institute for Defense Analysis. And they historically have had the institutional memory over long periods of time about what technologies work, what ways of automation work, what ways of AI work. And we're in great danger of losing that core institutional memory. If we want to pursue the path of automation and AI, which again, I'm very supportive of, we have to be willing to understand that there's a substantial amount of investment that's still required from the science and technology perspective or the research and development perspective to get a lot of these automation tools to the point where they're from technology readiness level 2 or 3, which means they're sort of in their infancy and prototyping and minimal viable product stage, up to what we need them to be in order to be the replacement for the people who used to do this work, the subject matter experts that we had in the form of action officers and other experts at the Institute for Defense Analysis and so on. And we're not there yet in many cases. I'll use an example. Everybody loves the concept of a digital twin. So you don't have to go out and shoot a missile at something or shock a ship the way that we historically have done. Instead, you can do it through simulation. And that's great, except it turns out that to get the simulators and the digital twins to the degree of fidelity necessary to get the results we need to make the decisions to make our warfighters safe is actually way more expensive than it is to actually do the shooting of the missile or the shocking of the ship. If we're ever going to get to the point where we can rectify that and remedy that, we're going to have to put a lot more effort into the science and technology to hone this, to validate it, to make sure it actually works and is not just giving us results that look good on paper, but actually reflect reality.
Yeah, you touched on the other 2 elements of this memo. The third point is that any of the folks that were not going to be among those 30 positions mentioned in the second point will receive a RIF notice. And the fourth point was the contractor personnel support provision that you mentioned a moment ago. The broad-based issue here is, what's your sense of what testing looks like in 2 years 5 years to be successful to achieve the outcomes the department needs it to achieve?
So there's a great phrase about form follows function. Well, in the testing world, testing needs to follow the way we fight. And the way we're fighting and the way we plan to fight increasingly will be this joint all-domain command and control JADC2-like approach with the joint force, lots of small things being coordinated, lots of drones, lots of autonomy. And again, that's great. That's the way the world needs to go. We need to make sure that our testing reflects the environment in which we're going to be deploying these systems and deploying the people who operate and fight with these systems. And right now, the reduction we have in our oversight and in other parts makes it very difficult to do this, because what we're left with are either individual contractors doing contractor-based testing, onesie twosie on their particular widgets, or we have services doing what we call developmental testing, where they're testing their systems, again, relatively in isolation. But what we're not going to have nearly as effectively as we need to are these joint testing environments for operational testing, where we really know how the systems are going to work when they're fielded. And that's going to be a big problem, because our whole military doctrine is based on precision. It's based on being able to route around jamming, route around congestion, routing around other ways that our adversaries are going to try to thwart what we're doing. And so we need to have extremely precise weapon systems that work under many different conditions. That is exactly the kinds of testing and operational testing that DOT&E and IDA have been doing for a long time. Without that oversight and without people holding everybody accountable to make sure the systems really work the way they're supposed to under the right conditions, is going to put our servicemen and women at great risk, because we're not going to be as confident those systems do what we need them to do under the right circumstances.
It is really easy, and I've seen a lot of this in Washington over the last several months. It's really easy to think about workforce cuts and wring hands and say, this is really going to be terrible for whatever the organization is that's affected. Is there any potential opportunity that you see here to change the way that the office does business and leverage something that may not have happened otherwise in the ordinary trajectory of where the office was going to go?
Yeah, absolutely. Again, there's some really great test organizations that are part of the services, the ATEC group, and with the Army, AFATEC, the Navy has groups as well. There's lots of really smart people there who've been doing some cool things with technology. When I was the DOT&E, I spent some time up at Aberdeen talking to the folks there in the Army who are doing some really interesting cutting edge work with AI. And I think it's important to be able to try to leverage that experience, plus also a lot of expertise that resides in national labs like Sandia and Oak Ridge, where people have put a lot of thought into automation and using AI for national security purposes. It's more important now than ever to be able to bring those groups of stakeholders together in the right environment with the right degree of classification and so on, and be able to share the lessons learned, because we don't have critical mass in any one place at the moment. And the cuts for DOT&E are not helping with that. However, throughout the defense industry base, this includes federally funded research and development centers like the Institute for Defense Analysis or the Software Engineering Institute or aerospace or MITRE and so on. There's a lot of expertise there, and bringing those groups together now and helping to share that information so that we can have the best practices and the patterns of effective use, that is more important now than ever before, because we don't have that critical mass in one place. So finding ways to network, finding ways to collaborate is going to be super important. I know that expertise is out there. I met with those people. They're wonderful people. But right now, they're all working in independent ways in silos, and we have to find a way to collapse those silos and bring them back together.
I think you told me when I was in Williamsburg and we got together a couple of months ago that the School of Computing, Data Sciences, and Physics that you are the first dean of is the first new school at William and Mary in 40 years. Is that right?
I think it's something like 55 years.
Yeah, longer than that yet. Time. So, and you've been doing a tremendous amount of work and talking a lot about how artificial intelligence is going to change the way that people work. And you've alluded to a couple of those concepts in this conversation. But it's what you're writing about, what you're talking about, speaking about, I think has a really important intersection with what we've talked about so far in this program about how AI will help people work and how it will help organizations work completely differently in not too short a period of time from today. What are the primary things that you're working on now at the college that you think apply to your friends and colleagues and peers that are still in the federal government, Doug?
Absolutely. Everybody, whether they're entry-level people, mid-career people, senior people are concerned, and rightly so, about the disruptive aspects and disruptive implications of generative artificial intelligence. A lot of it's been overhyped, but a lot of it is reality, and it's coming to fruition very, very quickly. One of the things that we're wrestling a lot with here, which I think is quite relevant for the broader world and the DoD in particular, is the impact on entry-level graduates. So for many years, people who were coming out of college could get entry-level jobs. Why could they do that? Well, oftentimes they were less expensive than people who were already there. Oftentimes they would come armed with the latest and greatest technologies, and they would be useful to help teach the people who are already in the workforce who had a lot more domain expertise, but maybe didn't know the latest tool, the latest capability. What's happening because of AI is that people are beginning to realize that they can take their existing workforce and make them very productive very rapidly. And what does that mean for people who are coming out of college? Well, they don't have an easy way to compete because they don't have the domain expertise. And increasingly, they don't necessarily even have the right tooling skills because we are having to adapt and adopt changes in higher education very quickly. And things that we took for granted, we could continue to teach courses and technologies and programming languages and platforms that we learned as graduate students 20 or 30 years ago that have sustained us for the past couple decades. That's been radically restructured. And so we're having to move very quickly. So if you extrapolate that into what's happening in other places in the government, where there's a lot of pressure to downsize the software development and software engineering workforce and replace them with AI, that's all, again, all well and good. But I'm not sure yet whether the technology is actually ready and mature enough to replace the people, number one. And number two, it's not clear that the people who reside or who remain have the wherewithal yet and the training and experience to come up to speed with that technology rapidly enough in order to be able to continue to do the work that they have to do day in and day out. So the work hasn't gone away, but the workforce has gone away. And so there's kind of this challenge, this chicken and egg issue about, can we train the remaining people rapidly enough to use today's generation of AI tools, which are still only a couple of years old, to the point where they can replace the workforce that's been left behind? I think we'll get there. I'm not sure we're going to get there as quickly as some people would like us to get there, but I think we also don't have a choice. We have to figure out ways to be effective. Fortunately, there are people within the Pentagon, in the CDAO office, and other parts that are looking very carefully at these issues. But as you well know, Francis, the government no longer drives the technology innovation cycle in these areas. This is almost exclusively being done in the commercial world with OpenAI and Google and Anthropic and so on. And so because the government is not driving this, we are somewhat at their mercy. And they are not considering the same kinds of requirements, the same kind of degree of certification, the same kinds of safety concerns for use of commercial applications of AI as we have to be responsible for in government and especially in the DoD. So I think there's still a disconnect between what people want to have happen and what maturity levels have reached or technology readiness levels have reached at this point. Once again, kind of focusing on the need for S&T, science and technology, for research and development. And I know there's some great people at places like DARPA and the various service labs, research labs, Air Force Research Lab, who are looking into this. But this is really going to require a partnership between universities, between the defense industry base, between government, if we're going to make this work at scale.
What are the greatest risks that you see in the process, the kind of the evolution that you just laid out there, Doug, from any of those stakeholders or to any of those stakeholders?
Sure. This is what we're going to see. We're going to see some people are going to throw themselves into AI and become over AI'd and not actually have the foundational knowledge to make sense of the results they're getting back from their tools that they're working with the large language models. That's one set of people. They're going to have irrational exuberance, to quote Greenspan, in this area. At the other end of the spectrum, we have people who I'll call the underconfident. These are people who have some good knowledge, but for whatever reason, either because their mentors or their teachers or their parents or someone has told them AI is bad, and if you use these tools, you'll go blind. They're going to hold back, and they're not actually going to embrace this and come up to speed. I think those are two of the biggest challenges, either over-reliance without enough background or underconfidence and therefore not being able to keep up with our competitors. Keep in mind that this is a global competition now with great powers. And a lot of those great powers produce many more engineers and scientists than the United States does at this point. And those places are also very well versed in AI. In fact, I'm sure you're aware that in China, they now have a requirement that people in K through 12, their equivalent of primary education, have to learn to use AI. We do not have that in the United States yet. So we're going to have a world very quickly where a lot of people will be very well versed in this. Now, will they be the over AI'd? Probably so. What we need to get to is what I like to call the augmented. Those are people who have deep foundational knowledge as well as a deep appreciation and expertise with using AI tools. Those are going to be the next generation of people who will be the leaders in government, in defense, in industry, in education. And the faster we can get our workforce and our educators up to speed on this, the more likely we will be successful in this global competition.
Doug, thank you for the first. If you keep doing that, you'll go blind reference in the history of the FedGov Today podcast. And thanks for joining me with your insight today. I appreciate it.
Thank you very much.
You can find a link to Secretary Hegset's memo about ODT&E on today's show page at fedgovtoday.com. The Central Intelligence Agency is moving out of the planning phase toward deployment of artificial intelligence. It's making AI models available all over its organization. The Chief Information Officer at the CIA, Linnea Jones, will tell you how they work and who's using them on the latest edition of FedGov Today TV. You can watch on demand anytime at fedgovtoday.com and the FedGov Today YouTube channel. The next FedGov Today podcast is coming next Tuesday, another big milestone for federal employee retirement. You can learn about that on that show, and every FedGov Today podcast is available anytime you want on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or on demand at fedgovtoday.com. I'm Francis Rose. Thanks very much for listening.